The Senate is expected to vote on that $3 trillion House-backed HEROES Act, providing more stimulus to Americans amid the coronavirus pandemic. And while critics say that it will not pass, many in Washington are still said to be weighing the possibility of another round of aid. Bipartisan efforts on the table include one from Senators Amy Klobuchar and Ben Sasse to give a $4,000 tax credit to those unemployed during the crisis. Joining me right now to talk about that and what it means for debt is the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Maya MacGuineas. Maya, it's great to have you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning. Great to be with you.
So with all of this stimulus during this shutdown and in this pandemic, I've been raising the notion that we're looking at debt right now, Maya, that is actually bigger or close to the size of the overall economy. Talk to us about the debt threat, Maya.
Yeah, I think the debt threat is real, and I think you're absolutely right. The chances are that this year we will hit the point where our national debt is the equivalent of the size of our economy. And that comes many years in advance of when we thought this would happen. I think the real issue here is not that we're borrowing during this crisis, because that's exactly when you need to borrow. But we went into this moment so woefully unprepared, where our debt was already almost as high as it had been, or it was the next highest it had ever been since the end of World War II, right? And that came after a very strong economic expansion where we should have been bringing our debt down. So we enter this moment, our fiscal finances are weak, and we're borrowing so much that suddenly this year, our deficit will be closer to $4 trillion than what we'd expected, which was $1 trillion. And I would add either of those numbers are kind of jaw-droppingly large. So while the focus that we need to be taking right now is clearly on the healthcare situation and the recession situation, what we're also going to need to do is be able to turn our attention to dealing with that huge debt threat as soon as the economy is strong enough that we can.
But Maya, how do you deal with it when you see what goes on behind the scenes politically? I mean, you know, when the Republicans want to raise defense spending, the Democrats want something else and say, well, we're not going to agree to this unless you would agree to more spending on this. I mean, just look at these last rounds of pandemic stimulus, and you see all of this other stuff coming in from all of these ideas that have nothing to do with the pandemic.
No, and that is exactly the dynamic that has been the problem with the fiscal health of our country for so long now, which is bipartisan cooperation doesn't mean all sides recognizing that, hey, the first step to dealing with the fiscal hole is to stop digging, to stop making it worse, and instead to start taking some strong measures to deal with the things that are growing our debt. Instead, what we've seen for years now is we'll have a deal where one side wants to borrow, the other side wants to borrow. We'll end up borrowing for both and making the fiscal situation much, much worse. And our ability to pivot to where we need to go, which is taking a strong look at where our spending is going, how to fix some of our biggest government programs, how we're going to pay for these things, that's going to require a willingness to confront those tough choices. And I think you're absolutely right. We haven't seen that recently. We've seen instead both sides kind of competing to see who can do more giveaways. And the worst thing, I think, is we're starting to see that in these economic recovery bills, because this is not the time for sticking your pet project into every emergency bill. This is a real emergency. And if we're going to borrow money, and again, this is the right time to borrow money, but we have to do so prudently. So we have to pick it for the things where you really need help, dealing with the healthcare issues, dealing with keeping businesses afloat so that when the economy recovers, we'll be able to have a quick and strong recovery. We need to target it and keep the kind of political grab bag mentality out of this.
Yeah, especially since 38 million Americans are out of a job looking for unemployment benefits. John Hilsenrath, jump in.
Yes, so I want to ask you about the interest rate situation, Maya. Some people are arguing that, well, interest rates are so low that we don't have to worry about the debt. And you get this from both sides of the political spectrum, that, we can keep borrowing as long as that interest rate is so low. And in fact, maybe we should because the interest rate is so low. What do you make of that, and what's your response to it?
Yeah, the first point I would make, John, is that you are right, and that there are all these new arguments coming out. There is always a push for the free lunch argument. Don't worry, we don't have to pay for this. It's so important, we shouldn't pay for it, or it will pay for itself. If those arguments sound too good to be true, they really are. And that is the case when it comes to kind of these economic theories around the debt. Just because interest rates are really low, which they are, doesn't mean that paying for something or spending on something is free. it means that pushing off when you pay for it costs a lot less. Still, if you borrow $1 trillion, you will have to pay for that $1 trillion for somewhere, and you can push it down with lower interest rates and interest payments, but when the bills come due, that's still $1 trillion. And if we don't want to pay for it, we're pushing it to our children, which is what we do so often. The second concern, of course, is that interest rates may not stay low forever. In fact, they very likely will not. And if and when interest rates go up, the borrowing costs of this huge, massive debt that we already have will skyrocket all of a sudden, and that would throw an economy back into a recession. So what we should do is acknowledge we're already borrowing a lot, and interest rates being low is helping us tremendously, but we still need to have a smart plan, and that plan basically is 3 parts. Focus on the healthcare issue right now, focus on keeping the economy ready for a recovery and into recovery as soon as we have dealt sufficiently with the pandemic and we can really come back strong, and then turn our attention, pivot over to the national debt, and once and for all start figuring out how we're going to get that under control. The key here is the debt can't grow faster than the economy, and that's exactly what it's doing. We're on a track where the debt will grow faster than the economy forever, and that's bad news for any country.
Wow. All right, Maya, we'll keep watching and talking with you as well along the way. Good to see you this morning, Maya. Thank you.